Hey, good day, and welcome to Fire Thoughts with Mr. Oz. This is the introduction to a series on wildland firefighting that's going to supplement a class that I teach both at Oxnard Community College and at College of the Canyons. We're out here in Towsley Canyon in the Santa Clarita area. If you hear a little dull roar in the background, that's the 5 freeway, which is right over here. And we're at a place where I've fought many a fire. At Towsley Canyon, we get fires out here every couple of years. It's just a normal place for us to get fires. Not as much lately as it used to be when there was fewer inhabitants in this area. I want to introduce myself. After years of trying to become a firefighter, 8 years trying with LA City, LA County, Beverly Hills, Glendale, Burbank, pursuing the fire job like so many of my students. During that time, I was a manager of sports chalet. I was a youth worker. I did a lot of public speaking back in those days, but finally around the age of 30, LA County Fire accepted me into their academy, and after a short academy, I became a firefighter. My family, we moved out to Santa Clarita from the La Cañada, La Crescenta area, and so I transferred out to Battalion 6. Pretty much worked here in the Santa Clarita Valley my whole career. A variety of reasons for that. I just loved it out here was the main thing, close to home, but I really grew to love wildland firefighting, and this is one of those areas in Los Angeles County Fire where we do a lot of that. After being a firefighter, I worked my way onto the patrol. I was a patrolman, drove the water tender, did things of that sort. But then I got drafted into the paramedic program. I spent a couple of years as a paramedic, actually 4 years. Enjoyed it. Enjoyed that I got to still fight fire, but also was doing the medical calls. Worked out here at Station 124. But shortly after that, I promoted to engineer. I had every intention of going on to being a captain someday, but I just loved being an engineer so much. I got stuck there and spent some time at a variety of stations, 73s, 11s in Altadena, then 76 where I became part of the hazmat team and drove a fire engine there. Got on a lot of wildland fires there in the Castaic area. Did a short stint in fire prevention, went to Fire Station 149 in Castaic. After some injuries, I spent 4 years there. I eventually went back to fire prevention. Hated working in an office, but I grew to love fire prevention too. It was while I was in fire prevention that with about 23 years on, we discovered that I had an ascending aortic aneurysm, which was lucky for me that it was found without it rupturing. I had open heart surgery, and the fire department decided that I was too broken to keep on the team. So I ended up having to retire, which put me in a weird thing. You know, what do I do now with my life? So I went to teaching. I'd done a lot of public speaking all my life, and College of the Canyons was kind enough to hire me. Shortly after that, I got a job with Oxnard Community College, and I've been teaching fire technology now for over 6 years. I absolutely love it. It's almost like this is my thing, and I'm really enjoying it. And so, after years of teaching wildland firefighting, I got a GoPro for my Christmas present. And I thought, you know, I'm going to start using this, and instead of trying to explain to my students about aspect and slope and fuels and things of this nature, I thought, well, why don't I take my class with me via the GoPro, and we'll go out and do some different kinds of venues and explain some things on the scene. This is meant to be a supplement to my class, so it's not going to be all-inclusive. There's going to be things I'm going to forget to say. This is a basic wildland class, an introduction to wildland firefighting for the wannabe firefighter. I think you're going to find some great information here. In my classes, I like to use a lot of different teaching methods and learning methods and memorization joggers. I don't have the best memorization in the world, so I learned a long time ago to use mnemonics and alliteration and things like the 3x3 of fire behavior. That's just a term that I use myself to help understand fuel, weather, and topography, and the major subheadings of each one of those. Different things like that that we'll be doing in my class. I might include them on some of these videos. Again, it's basic. I'm a learner. I'm not an expert. I have a lot of experience, but I'm certainly no expert. But we're going to refer to experts, men like J.P. Harris, Chief Harris with LA County Fire, who's been on many a green sheet report, after action report. You might have seen his videos. If you haven't, get them on wildland firefighting. We're going to look at, we use Bill T's book, the Handbook on Wildland Firefighting, in my class. It's a standard thing that you're going to learn to use some tools. In fact, some of the tools I have right here in my pocket, one of them is my old 10 and 13 card. 10 standard firefighting orders on one side, and the 13 watch out situations on the other. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're going, hey, wait a minute, there's 18 watch out situations. You know, calm down, guys. Take a chill pill. When I got this card, there were 13. We've added 5 more since then because of different fires and the lessons that we learned from disasters and fatality fires. Now there's 18, but when I did this card, it was 13. So I used this to help me memorize every year and relearn the firefighting orders in the 10 and 18. We also, every firefighter should have an IRPG. In my classes, this is going to be an extra credit thing, but it only costs a couple of bucks online. Get one. It's a very helpful tool. In fact, on the back is your 10 and 18, and inside you have the downhill checklist and all sorts of stuff on ICS, hazmat, all sorts of information that helps you as a wildland firefighter. So get yourself a copy of the IRPG, and we'll be using that. And of course, you need to learn LCES and what it means. I like to keep things simple. Some people use LACES. They've added awareness in there. To me, awareness is the big umbrella of wildland firefighting. You start with awareness, you fight fire with awareness, you end with awareness. Awareness is always a part of firefighting. The point of LCES, when Paul Gleason suggested that many years ago, was to simplify the 10 down to the most basic and essential points to remember on wildland fire. Lookouts, communication, escape routes, safety zones. These are some of the minimal things in my class that we're going to address. And as this is my introduction to each one of the different lessons, I'm going to end here, and we're going to go to some different subject matters like alignment. We're going to talk about alignment and how it affects aspect, slope, wind, temperature. We're going to talk about aspect. We're going to talk about fuels. We're going to go to different places and get a sample of these different things via video, and hopefully help you as a student in my class or just somebody watching this on YouTube get a little bit of a better handle on what we're talking about when we say light fuels or ground fuels, what we mean by surface fuels, or what I call medium brush, which I'm looking at this direction, but behind you, you're seeing a different kind of fuel, light fuels, grass fuels. So we're going to talk about some of these different things, and I'm going to cut it off here. Hopefully you'll enjoy these little sessions. They're meant to be short. They're meant to be informational. And again, I welcome your feedback, but keep it positive, guys. You know, we're just learners here. And remember, I'm just an old firefighter. Sometimes the memory isn't what it used to be. If I say a fact wrong, or if I throw a date out there and it's not exactly right, don't worry about it. Point it out on the comment section. I welcome that, and we can all learn together. Thanks a lot for coming to Fire Thoughts with Mr. Oz. Again, my name's Randy Osborne, but some of the students call me Mr. Oz. So thanks a lot, and welcome to Fire Thoughts.
Here's
Here's a copy of the fuel flammability cards that you can get from Doug Campbell's website. He has them in magnets, stickers, cards, but it helps you visualize aspect and the times of day that the different exposures are dangerous. As we discuss the subject of aspect, we need to define some terms to start off. And the first one, of course, is aspect itself. Aspect is sometimes called exposure. And when we refer to aspect, we are talking about a point on a hill and the direction that it faces. So I'm at the top of a hill here and I'm looking into the sunset, which is west. So this slope in front of me is facing west. It's a west aspect. Now, if I pulled out my iPhone or compass and was at the foot of this hillside, my compass would be saying east. And yes, we could refer to this as the east hill. We're facing east going into the east hill, but that's not the right way to think of it. Think of it as the way the slope is facing in relation to the points of the compass. So, aspect is that part of the hill that faces either west, east, south, or north. The other definition we need to have is the slope. So when we speak of slope in percentages. And slope is the steepness of the hillside. So I'm going to turn you around just for a second and try and do so easily. This is a very steep slope. It's a west-facing aspect in a box canyon that rises rapidly. And I haven't measured this, and I'm not going to venture to say the percentage of slope, but it's steep, very steep. Some of the other terms we need to talk about is solar radiation. When we talk about aspect, solar radiation is a very important part of the discussion. When we speak of aspect, we think of it as the time of day that the sun is on the different parts of the hillside in relation to the points of the compass. So the east-facing aspect on the other side of this hill gets sun on it from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. That amount of solar radiation is very minimal. It comes in the cool of the day, and the sun is just rising. And by 10, 11, depending on the time of year, it's already getting into the shade. South aspect, on the other hand, gets lots of sun. Depending again on the time of year, pretty much you can say that the sun is on the south aspect all day long. But the critical times are, of course, around noon. So from 11 to 1 or 2, we're very concerned about south aspects, but that concern is going to grow as the day goes on, because the more solar radiation it gets, the more heated the fuels become. So solar radiation is what heats the earth. It's those sun rays that come from the sun, and they're absorbed by the ground in varying degrees. We talk about this in the weather section of our class, but here we're just discussing it in relation to aspect and the fuels. As the solar radiation is absorbed by the fuels and the ground, then they also radiate or reflect back that heat. And that gives us pretty much our temperature throughout the earth. It's both the radiation coming in, but also that which is coming off of the earth. The fuels, however, absorb and release that solar radiation throughout the day, depending on the time of day. As I said earlier, the east aspect absorbs radiation early in the morning. For the rest of the day, they're releasing that radiation and not absorbing more. So our eastern aspects are usually cooler, don't burn as ferociously or forcefully, unless it's a wind-aided fire or a slope-aided fire. The south, on the other hand, is receiving solar radiation throughout the whole day and also the ambient air temperature as well. So the south can be quite concerning to us. But our greatest concern is right here, on southwest and west-facing slopes, because they receive ambient air all day long, increasing the temperature of the fuels, and they're receiving some solar radiation as the day goes on. But at the end of the day, between 3, 4, 5, even sometimes as late as 6, these portions of the hillside can be explosive. They reach high temperatures towards the end of the day. We'll talk later about why this is so dangerous to firefighters and why some of our most disastrous fires have happened on southwest and west-facing slopes. The Glen Allen fire in Altadena, for one. Late in the day, somewhere between 1600, around then, I'm not remembering the exact time of day. The Loop fire, similar time of day, late in the day, superheated fuels from solar radiation, the fire strikes the bottom of the hillside, and we get area ignition on a hillside. So think of aspect as an enormously important part of the conversation on alignment. Wind, slope, and aspect, when they are all together, can lead to dangerous situations that are threatening to firefighters. The last thing to talk about is definition, that we, more or less, is relative humidity and fuel moisture. So, of course, whenever temperature goes up, humidity goes down. And the same is true of our fuels. When the solar radiation is direct on the fuels, the temperature of those fuels rises, and in our finer fuels, in a very quick amount of time, they're releasing any moisture that they might be holding. So when you put together fuel moisture lows like we have in California right now as a result of drought, and then solar radiation that draws what little fuel moisture is in those fuels, and then you get direct sunlight on them, altogether it creates situations explosive. I'm going to take a break here and put on the head cam, and I'm going to show you some different aspects. Remember though, it's December 31st as I'm doing this. The sun has just gone down, and I'm going to take these photos tomorrow in the morning, and you'll see some different areas, but it's green now. Don't let that green fool you. In the spring, that's going to dry up and it's going to cure, and this is going to be lightning explosive fuels and situations that can burn rapidly. But what I want you to notice as I show you the different aspects or exposures is the different kinds of fuel that are in each aspect. So note that, and note also the time of day, as I said earlier, when those aspects are most vulnerable to extreme amounts of solar radiation, thus low fuel moistures, high fuel temperatures, and explosive situations. subject today is aspect. We always talk about aspect in conjunction with the subject matter of alignment. Alignment is when different behavior factors, different fire behavior factors, get in a line together and are all working to the advantage of the fire. So when wind, slope, and aspect are working together against us, we want to be out of the way of that fire. We want to be fighting it from the other end, not from the head of the fire. An example of this is the Glen Allen fire. Now, when I bring up fire fatality fires or refer to them, you need to be very clear here. Our job is not to criticize, to Monday morning quarterback, to name call, or any of the other foolish things that sometimes we do as firefighters. Our job is to analyze, learn from the lessons, make sure that we don't repeat those actions, and do everything we can to learn more about why fire behaves the way it does. So when I bring up something like the Glen Allen fire, or the Kramer fire, Loop fire, whatever it might be, Calabasas fire, I'm not bringing these up to point any fingers. There are a lot of things that we do as firefighters that we can get away with again and again and again. But then we get on that one fire where we didn't think through the possibilities, and the fire behavior acts in a way that we weren't prepared for, and it nips us in the butt. Glen Allen fire was a fire that was in Altadena, California. It was in the 1990s. I forget the exact year. I'm going to guess 93, something like that. The fire started at about 1500 from a car fire, spread into the brush, right in the urban interface. Multiple companies, 11's got there first, gave a initial size up. Other engine companies got there. We're working their way up from the bottom up, trying to cut off the different ends, the two flanks of the fire. Crew 2-2, I believe it was, got landed above the fire and started cleaning up the upper edge of the fire. The fire had pretty much laid down. They got the east end of the fire, and they were starting to now come around the west end of the fire. They started working downhill on the fire, which was creeping downhill, backing down, 2 to 3 foot flame lengths, very benign. But the day was wearing on, and they were on a southwest-south aspect. I'm going to talk about why that's significant in a second. And at exactly 1614, they were working their way down. The fire, which had been punking around, hit some fuels, ran up the hill, and in a matter of seconds, the crew was being overrun. 2 firefighters ran and laid down. 2 ran to 2 different sides. 2 died. The ones that laid down, severely burned, but survived. In fact, one of them is a firefighter with LA County Fire, and the other is still a fire suppression aide with LA County Fire, working at Camp 2. At least the last I heard. It was 1614 when this entrapment happened. Temperatures were 80 to 90 degrees. The wind was 5 to 6 miles per hour. These were not extreme fire behavior factors. But when aspect, slope, and wind worked together, and the fire reignited up some already burnt areas, but not completely burned, and other unburned areas, and ignited this pretty much a box canyon, it just exploded on it. The problem was aspect. That was one of the main problems. Solar radiation heats fuels on different slopes at different times of day. When we talk about aspect, we're talking about basically the direction a slope is facing. So the slope behind us here is a south and southwest facing slope. I chose this not because it's a box canyon in a similar place to Glen Allen, but it's a similar aspect. And what happened at Glen Allen could happen anywhere, especially when a crew is working downhill on a fire. When we talk about aspect, we're talking about the direction that the slope faces in relation to the compass. So I got my compass here, and I'm going to use a piece of paper to hopefully shade it enough here so you can see. Can you see that? Hopefully you can read it. The compass is facing north. So this way is north. The aspect, or also referred to as exposure, of this hill is not north, it's south. It's which way it's facing. We're facing north, it's facing south. A lot of my students get confused on that. So make sure you understand it's which way the slope or the hillside is facing, not the way you are facing when you look at it. So this is a combination, and you're going to find when we're talking about aspect, there are very few pure north aspects, pure east aspects. They're usually a combination, like this slope, that has indentations from water runoff and other erosion types of things. And you're going to have a variety of exposure. But basically, this is south, southwest. Now, what concerns us about south and southwest exposures is that, number one, what kind of fuel? Well, what kind of fuel do you see? You see grass and a little bit of light brush here and there. This is typical of south exposures. Why? Because it gets the most sun. South exposures have sun on it almost all day. Now, from 12 or 1200 to 1400, noon till 2 p.m., it gets the most solar radiation and is the most dangerous during that time of day. But I would consider south exposure to be wary, to consider it dangerous pretty much all day long, especially when it has a mixture of southwest and then over here to your left, my right, where I'm facing, that's kind of goes over to a western exposure. And this hillside during the latter part of the day can really explode. So let me explain why. We've got light grasses. That all day long, when we have south and southwest exposures, they're getting ambient air, which is heating up the fuels. That solar radiation is being absorbed by the fuels and also being released. Now, as the fuels increase in their temperature, what happens to the fuel moisture? Well, just like in our air, when the temperature goes up, the humidity goes down. It's the same with fuels. When the temperature goes up, the fuel moisture goes down. So whatever moisture has been being held in these fuels is being given off or given up throughout the day. Towards the latter part of the day, on a south exposure from 1200 to 1400 and maybe even beyond, it's critical. It's getting super solar radiation. It's not just the ambient air, but direct radiation making the fuels even hotter. When we have hotter fuels, they are closer to their ignition temperature, therefore explode into fire faster. Now, the other thing that's important to understand with this is that the southwest portion is going to be getting critical later in the day. The west, more around 4 o'clock, the southwest and west portions, anywhere from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, and in, depending on the time of year, even as late as 6 o'clock. It's getting direct solar radiation, has very hot fuels. The Glen Allen fire happened at 1614. Superheated fuels with a slope in its advantage, a chimney that played a part in the topography, and a light breeze, only 5 to 6 miles per hour, but as the fire picked up in intensity, what do you think that wind did? It sucked air in with it and increased that wind, and it was up that hill in a matter of seconds. We're very fortunate that only the 4 suffered injuries and death. The rest were able to escape and get up to a little road and hide in the lee side of the road. They used their shovels to protect them from the heat, laid down, tried to get out of that area, and fortunately no more were injured. So I want to just kind of recap this. We're going to go to, I'm going to share some more definitions at a different location. We're going to go to some different aspects. But what I want you to remember about South and Southwest, number 1, light, flashy fuels. Number 2, superheated in the hottest portions of the day. And number 3, on the Southwest, and as we go to the West, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, we get that superheated fuel in the latter part of the day. So there's one more significant part to that a lot of people don't talk about. When do we usually get these fires? In the later part of the morning, in the early afternoon, at least out here in Santa Clarita, in the hottest part of the day. So we've been fighting fire as the day goes on, and in the Loop Fire, the Glen Allen Fire, and many others of our fatality fires, it happened near the mop-up stages when we were closing up the last parts of the line, and we were a little bit desperate to get the job done and go home. And so we make decisions that maybe aren't the best decisions. We've been getting exposed to CO all day. We're tired, we're exhausted, and then we get to a portion of the fire that's actually at that time of day the most dangerous. This is what happened at the Loop Fire, this is what happened at the Glen Allen Fire, and many others. Kramer Fire, if I remember correctly, same time of day, same kind of slope, same kind of aspect. So before I cut off here, we're going to go to another location. I'm going to talk about slope, aspect, solar radiation, and humidity and fuel moistures, kind of give some definitions there. Then we'll go to some different aspects, north, west, and east, and take a look at them, give you some facts on those. Won't talk as much about those. This one is your most critical, and southwest and west. Okay, taking a break. I've gone up a draw here into a chimney, actually a box canyon. It's more of a box canyon. And I chose this spot so I can show you both west and east exposure at the same time. Right now we're looking at a west exposure, and a lot similar to our southern exposure we just saw. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you is that this area has had fire in the last 5 years. So mostly what we're seeing here is grass. A lot of times on western exposures, if we haven't had fire in a while, we're going to have a little bit more of light to medium brush. In fact, up at the end of the canyon, that part of this canyon didn't get fire, and it's actually southern exposure, and it has more brush than right here, which is not typical, but it's because that hasn't burned in the last 5 years. So keep that in mind as I show you these different areas. The things I want you to notice is western exposure, very similar to southern, except as I mentioned before, you're going to have the issue of it's hotter, it's later in the day, and now the solar radiation, the direct sunlight is on it, so we're going to have very high temperatures in our fuels, and therefore we're going to have explosive fire conditions. In a situation like this with the Box Canyon, which right now we're in a very similar place, not as steep, not as high of a hill as the Glen Allen fire that we talked about earlier. But take a look behind and you'll see we have a mixture of grass and brush, some light brush, and then I'm going to do my best to turn around here without making you feel sick to your stomach from all of the fast movement. You can see up at the end there, this box canyon. Now let me see if I can do this right. Okay, there you go. And it's a little bit heavier, and that's actually southern exposure, but as I said before, that portion did not get burned by the same fire that burned this portion. But here's what I want you to notice the most. Now we have turned to an eastern exposure. That hill is facing east. Right now I'm facing east because it's behind me. And notice that it's about 1500 right now, maybe 1530. I haven't looked in a couple of minutes what the time is, but it's about 1530. It's fully shaded. This is cold fuel behind us. If I had my infrared thermometer with me and I shined it on, directed it on that fuel, and then directed it on this western fuel. Now this is January, so we're not going to get an extreme difference, but if it was August, we could have a 30 to 40 degree difference in temperature of our fuels. That makes a huge difference in how rapidly fire moves, the kind of flame lengths we're going to get, the speed in which fire is going to go up these slopes. So keep that in mind. East slope gets sun 0800 to 1000, maybe a little later. Then it's in the shade almost the whole rest of the day. Eastern slopes, not as light in fire activity, not as heavy in fuels as northern exposures, but kind of similar to northern exposure that it does not get a lot of solar radiation. And then back to our western exposure, does get more solar radiation, gets it in the latter part of the day. I would consider in the summer this hillside to be extremely dangerous. From, you know, around noon you need to be concerned about it, but from about 1400 till at least 1600, if not more like 1700. In August, I'd even go as late as 1800. So here's our east and our west. I'm going to move to another location and show you north, and you aren't going to believe the difference in fuel. Hey, I just wanted to go off on a tangent here. You'll find out I do that a lot in class. They call me Mr. Rabbit Trail. That's a little joke. But I wanted to point out a little factoid and a little weird or odd thing. It's January, and if you look right behind me, you're going to see we got green grass. It's starting to grow. I'm going to turn you and have you look down here. So we've been getting some rain finally here in California, and we got grass, green grass. But right next to it, we got dead grass, old grass, and old tumbleweeds and bulrushes. Well, just because we've had some rain, and just because things have started greening up, don't think that doesn't mean this hillside won't burn. Now, I'm not about to take out a match and prove that to you, but I've been on a fire at this time of year, and it was weird. We went out and we had a little grass fire. It didn't burn very fast. It burned, in fact, really slow. If it didn't have slope and a breeze in its to its advantage, it wouldn't have burned even more than an acre. But it burned a little bit, between 1 and 2 acres. It was not a big deal. We had it out pretty quick. Got lines around it and put it out, and it burned all this old dead stuff. And as we drove away, my captain, Bob Sheets, I was working overtime with Bob that day, he points out and he says, "Hey Randy, look at that. Look back at where our fire was." And you could not see where our fire was because basically all you could see was the green grass. And that's something I've never had happen before, where we drove away from a fire and couldn't even see any effect or any results from the fire. We just saw the green grass. So again, just because we got green grass doesn't mean this isn't going to burn. Remember, some of our worst fires in Southern California have happened in January, have happened in December. Usually it's because of a Santa Ana event, but it can happen any time of year. as long as we've got cured fuels, as long as we've got temperature and wind, we can have fire. It was just a little side note. I wanted to go off on a tangent here and point that out to you. Before I go on to talk about northern aspect, I want to elaborate a little bit on how the Glen Allen fire and some other things that happened around the same time, some other fires, affected LA County Fire Department. Right around that same time we had the Calabasas fire. It was the same year as the earthquake, if I remember correctly, the Northridge earthquake. That was a Santa Ana event. It was a wind-driven fire, and like a lot of wind-driven fires, on the last day of the Santa Anas, the wind started to die off. When that happens, there's a very common occurrence where the wind dies off and we get kind of a lull period with no wind at all. And those that aren't used to fighting fire under those conditions are oftentimes caught by surprise when rather abruptly the wind conditions go back to our normal diurnal winds, our normal down canyon at night, up canyon during the day type of winds. Well, at the Calabasas fire situation, a Glendale firefighter was down a road, mid-slope. It was a chimney. It was 4-ish, like we've been talking about. It was a southwest-west exposure. The sun had been on this section. The fuels were very cured, very dried out, and very hot. Fire had been punking around down in this canyon, this little draw, and it hit this chimney and went ripping up the chimney right around the same time. The winds changed direction, so we had alignment. Wind in the favor of the fire, very steep slope, very dry, superheated fuels, because of the aspect was southwest-west at the latter part of the day around 4-something. Now, because of that event and this Glendale firefighter getting burned and the Glen Allen event and some other things, J.P. Harris and a lot of the chiefs in LA County Fire Department decided to do some re-education for all of us. And one of the people they went to for some advice and used some of his materials was a guy named Doug Campbell. And I want you to remember that name. In fact, I'm going to encourage every single one of you to Google Doug Campbell Fire Prediction System. And you'll get to his website, and there's a ton of free material there, articles you can read. There's stickers and magnets and things you can buy from him and books that you can buy. I recommend all of it. I think the guy has some really good points. And if you've seen those charts that show east exposure, west exposure, south exposure, north exposure, and shows when they're critical, what parts of day they're critical fire behavior and those kind of things, I recommend having those. In fact, in my class, I'm going to give out a magnet or a sticker to every student. I think you should do that. I think you should go get those. So let's look at our last kind of aspect. We're looking at a north-northwest aspect. Now this is a little deceiving here because you're still seeing some sun on this, and that portion, some of it's west, northwest. And the reason that it's so green is this is a riparian zone on the north face. When you have north face type areas, you're going to have greener, heavier fuels. So what you can see here is a lot of oaks, a lot of heavy brush. We got brush up there that's over 6 to 10 feet tall. So north face, north exposure, heavy fuels. You add to that, this is a riparian zone where we have lots of moisture. You're going to have oaks, you're going to have greener fuels. Now, what's dangerous about north fuels? They don't get a lot of sun, or north faces. They don't get a lot of sun. They don't burn ferociously unless it is a wind-aided vent. And when we have, hey, the sun's gone down, so I'll take off my sunglasses. You have heavy fuels, they don't catch fire as easy. But when they do catch fire, and when you have a wind-driven fire, the BTUs from this portion of the fire are going to be off the chart. So burns hot, burns furious if it gets going. usually this side of the canyon. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, we've had fires in here. That side's burned tons of times. This side, I don't think it's burned in decades, because it's just really hard for the fire to get going in this thick stuff. Once it does get going, it burns pretty hot and heavy. One last thing I want to say, for those of you who live in the LA County area, every time you drive the 5, you can get a good illustration of what we've been talking about on aspect. As you go over the Newhall Pass into the Santa Clarita area, over what's called Wildland Summit, if you look to the north, you're going to see the south exposures. And those south exposures, tons of grass. In fact, LA County Fire, early in the season, they fight a fire there almost every year. It's a given. You're going to have a fire at Wildland Summit every year, and it's usually going to be on the northbound side of the freeway. If you look to the other side of the freeway, the southbound side of the freeway, at the northern exposure, you're going to see heavy brush, thick brush, lots of oak trees, lots of variety of sage, chamise, you name it, it's in there, and it's thick. Why? Because it hasn't burned in decades. It just barely ever burns. The last big fire I know of in that area is in the 70s, before I was on the department. So the point is, get out and look around. Get out your compass on your cell phone or your smartphone or whatever, and start looking at these different exposures and learn for yourself. See what the different fuels are like on the different exposures. Learn and memorize the times of day that the different exposures are super dangerous to you. And of course, they're always dangerous, but on an east-facing slope, even later in the day, that's a great place to catch a fire. Be aggressive, go after it. On a southwest face at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, don't be so aggressive. Fight from the anchor point up. Stay below the fire, don't get above the fire. So learn about aspect and slope, think about alignment, keep these things in mind along with LCES, and you won't be a victim. Thanks a lot. This is Randy Osborne with Fire Thoughts from Mr. Oz.